life challenge, life strategy that fits with the kind of person each one of us is. So, where does that leave us? Let's go back to that image of the boat that I imagined we are all in. And of course, in reality, we're not in one boat, but in many. Although we have in common a wish to make things better in our own communities and in our shared world. The ethical engines are in full throttle. And we may not be in a big boat or a flashy one or one that arrives first past the finish line, but none of us are sitting out. That engagement with the world in the first place, that acceptance of responsibility, that conviction of agency for your individual capacity to make things better, was the hardest decision of all. And it was difficult because it's easier to deal with the things in front of us. There's enough work in finishing courses, in doing laundry and commuting to work and paying the rent. It is enough of a challenge to raise kind children and get along with difficult neighbors. It is enough strain to shovel the snow and nurse our parents and still remain a pleasant human being. That first decision to engage with the world beyond the immediate was crucial. Getting into that boat was the hardest decision of all the decisions to come. I want to thank you for sharing your evening with me to think about what comes next. Thanks.
So we'll open this up. Any questions or comments? I must say, one of the things that you said early on, I wonder if you could elaborate a bit. You said that you really are optimistic, and it's nice to development of this optimism. You said you're optimistic that things could actually be better as a result of the way things are now, and I wonder if you could just elaborate a bit more fully on that.
One of my favorite stories from the research that I've been doing on civil society movements was a comparison of an early World Trade Organization campaign. And at the time, there was a controversial 400-page draft document that some government official had leaked to one of the protest organizations that was following the trade negotiations. And they took that 400-page document in Washington and ran down the street and went to a quick copy store and made 8 copies and then ran to the courier, and the courier then put those 8 copies in envelopes that with luck 4 or 5 days later would show up with their counterpart organizations all over the world, and then they could start the campaign. Only 5 years later, that same sharing of information could happen in a second. Individual people sitting in their own living rooms could participate. People anywhere in the world could, if they wanted to, engage on global discussions. And indeed, the Sri Lankan family that I had spent time with in 1986, who had just received electricity, now send me emails, and we talk on Skype. The world, if nothing else had changed, now has this enormous scope for action.
Hi, I'm Julia, and I have to say, when I saw your name and your title on the lecture, coming for this lecture, I was surprised, because it's been my experience for the last 8 years that less and less people from CEDAW or DFID are allowed out to talk to people like us.
There's 2 of us in the room.
I know, and so I'll be very careful about what I say. But no, in all seriousness, I sat on the board for I sat on the board for 6 years of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, And during that time, we helped shepherd along and pass the Better Aid Bill, or the ODA Accountability Act. And I think we and the rest of civil society was instrumental in getting that bill passed. And then we've seen in the reports to Parliament that have come out subsequently as a result of that bill, because it requires that we report on all ODA spending, that there's been a real a sense that the human rights agenda and the perspectives of the poor that were so inherent to that bill and were supposed to be prescriptive in terms of what our government was going to spend money on have become less and less important. And both within civil society, I mean, I sat on the board when we had members calling us. We had 100 members, including the biggest NGOs and the smallest NGOs that were delivering development assistance. I sat on the board while we were defunded, and we had members calling us saying, you know, my CETA person is telling me to take human rights out of this proposal. And it happened enough. Like, it wasn't, you know, we were not conspiracy theorists. We were hearing this. We did surveys to demonstrate that, in fact, people were receiving the advice that no longer should we include human rights language, no longer should we talk about rights-based agendas, even though we had just worked so hard to get this bill passed that said directly human rights approaches needed to be integrated into all ODA spending. And since then, I mean, at that time, CETA was also doing workshops for civil society on rights-based approaches. They were engaging with civil society. We had senior members of CETA coming out to our meetings, and we were sort of collectively coming up with solutions about how CETA could implement. And that's dead in the water. I mean, it's so dead that it's...
You asked just the right person, because I'm actually responsible.
Excellent, yes. So I'm hoping that you can speak to that.
Yes.
Okay.
No. It's an absolute fluke, but my day job, I'm responsible for the implementation of the ODAAA and for the new policy on partnership with civil society. So the ODAAA is crucially important. This is the act that says Canada's development assistance has to respect, among other things, poverty reduction goals and respect of human rights. Anything that we do that counts as ODA has to be checked off against that. Any policy that's announced has to be implemented. Our part of the organization is in the full throes of making sure that everybody knows this is what it means. This is what we have to support. Any project that you put through, you have to show how it's contributing to poverty reduction and how it's supporting human rights. So I hope the stories that you heard were just a sign of people not being sure what that meant. But we're working very hard to make sure that people know that this is what we do, this is law. And on some of the other aspects, and they're very tightly related, over the summer we put out for public consultation a new civil society partnership policy. The minister and senior officials of the department met with civil society organizations, including the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, member organizations, and all the regional councils, to talk about what would this change of policy be like. And we've received all of the comments, been busy tidying things up, and are sending up to the minister for approval a whole new policy on how the department, because it's a new department, CETA no longer exists, it's going to deal with civil society organizations. And we hope that this is a big step forward in making things different. But you can ask me questions about my talk, too. But you can ask me questions about CETA, former CETA, DFAT. Some of them I'll tell to. I'll say, Jim, you have an answer to that one. I spent a lot of time when I was at the North South Institute writing papers about how it was that CETA did all of its work with civil society organizations very badly. So now I end up penance, being responsible for making it better.
We have the Sustainable Trend Student Group has brought forward a motion to the board to consider divesting the investments of fossil fuels. And so to inform that conversation, we organised a discussion with a group of alumni panelists to
That's really interesting.
just debate that idea and that concept. And one of the alumni who has been an activist, since he was at Trent, suggested that it was very important that any action that is recommended be the right action, and that today, because issues are so significant and so urgent, we cannot afford to back the wrong solution. So it's just an interesting thought, contrary to just act and just do something, that actually really should be researched and be very careful, be very deliberate that what you're acting on is the right thing. So I just thought it would be interesting to hear you comment on that thought, that paradigm.
None of us can, certainty is a great gift if you have it. But you should also be really nervous if you're certain. There's so many things that can affect a decision. You can be certain of value statements. I'm the kind of person who believes in X, therefore I will not do Y. But certainty about what's the decision to make, what's the right strategy to take up, because there's so many other variables. One of the great gifts of living in this time in the world is that we have so much access to information and other points of views. And we're better to have that kind of conversation than in a university, a whole room full of people who are trained to identify and to examine different points of views. But we can never be sure it's the right way to go. That's why it's hard.
Hi, Alison. My name's Anissa. I'm a student at Trent. So you talked about these four possible approaches, and you're working maybe in the progress as possible approach.
All government officials have to be in that quadrant.
But I'm just wondering, if that really is your point of view, or if you subscribe to any of the
I'm rich in points of view.
And if you could just talk a little bit about your own personal philosophy and why.
Well, we get an opportunity tomorrow to talk a little bit more about the career directions various people have had. And certainly when I left Trent and graduate studies, my conviction at that time was that when bad decisions were being made, you needed to have a voice, and you needed to have a voice in a way that you would be heard. So it becomes a strategy question. Whose voices are heard and under what circumstances? And indeed, one of the books that I wrote when I was with the North South Institute was on the whole politics of legitimization. Who gets heard more than others? Whose voice is legitimate and whose is not? So I spent time outside of government, spending a lot of time complaining about policies and procedures that eventually led, without any of my help, to the ODAAA. And was very frustrated because it's this big edifice. And so time passed and I said, well, I'll make a bigger difference if I'm inside this big black box. But big black boxes have a whole other dynamics. And indeed I get really frustrated because academics would come in and say, oh, we want to do such and such, and they'd get more attention than the people inside the building. So well, I was just out there, you weren't listening to me then. So whose voices get heard and in what order, in the sense of whose voice is more important than others. Would it make a difference if I were the assistant deputy minister? But you don't have any choice over your work. The higher you go up in senior ranks, you become more and more manager of processes, and very little choice about where your responsibilities lie. Would it be better to go back out into the academic world? Like my friend Keith Stewart, should I chain myself to the fence outside of the building? Well, I get more pictures then, but that might be kind of career limiting. It's a very real set of dilemmas that I present in the talk, because they're very personal ones. How do you make the most change? Is it inside of government? Is it indirect service to people in your own community? Is it sitting, writing books in a research institute? Is it organizing on the street? The answers aren't always evident. So sometimes you try, and then change direction. I want to tell you a story. I change jobs about every 2 years. So it's either I have a really low, small attention span, or I'm trying to knock on other kinds of doors. So I was listening to the Ideas program on CBC, and they did, this is years and years ago, but they did a special episode on genius. What is it to become a genius? And they did a study of Nobel Prize winners. And they said, is there something this group of people has in common that attributes to their genius? So I was listening carefully. I said, okay, maybe I could be smarter. I can pay attention. And they all had 3 things in common. All of them had made their Nobel Prize winning discovery not in the field in which they were trained. Not in the field in which they were trained, and on average, every 10 years, they did a massive career change that would require going back to first-year university textbooks. But because they had a trained, analytical brain, they looked at old problems in a new way. And that's where they made their discovery. And so I said to myself, well, I could change my career every 10 years and my brain would get better. And then the second thing they all had in common was significant creative focus. So the study was made all of prize laureates in the hard sciences, but all of them were artists or patrons of the arts or supporters of dance or musicians or composers. And they spent a significant part of their life, and I was like, okay, well, I could do that. I could really focus on my creative pursuits and my intellectual pursuits and my really big brain. And then the third thing they all had in common, I failed at. All of them slept no more than 5 hours a night. And my feminist critique that followed, because they were all men, was that I was assuming that there was somebody else who actually cleaned the house and did the laundry while they were getting such big brains. Was that a segue?
Anybody else want to pick up on that theme? Maybe Jim, you could address also the question of the dilemmas of working within government.
Well, I'd like to, I guess, perhaps just go back to the question of, I guess there's sometimes it just comes to compulsion. You just feel you've got to do something. So you go and you try. And then it will, I guess, push you one way or another. I guess I didn't think I'd have a career in government. I didn't know if I'd ever have a career at all. I knew I wanted what I wanted to do. I just didn't know if it would ever amount to it. But as Alison says, you get into any system. It doesn't matter whether it's in an NGO or a family of NGOs or whether it's in a business. And there are hierarchies and there are rules and there are limitations. I guess what you have, if going back to compulsion, if you kind of have an idea of where you want to go and why you're doing it, that makes it the right thing for you to do. You feel compelled to see change in the world or improvement in people's lives, or even if it's just incremental, day to day. I'm only moving this process from here to there. If you can keep your eye on the prize of it actually moving towards a better place, then you can stay with it a little longer. And I'm a great believer in democracy. We all have some strengths and weaknesses about that system, but as Churchill said, the best one we've got till another one comes along. Or the worst one we've got till another one comes along. It really is, we elect a bunch of people, they come in with good ideas, they're working with a very elaborate public sector that is trying to keep them, from making mistakes, from spending money poorly or being perceived as spending money poorly, do all those other things. But we are kind of compelled to follow where they lead. And you can't be in government and you know, be opposed to that principle for, you know, for a very long time. You can start government and leave government quite quickly. But it does, and again, at some point, I've got friends now who are leaving government, and just because they're sort of, well, you know, I've had it. I feel I could do better somewhere else. Maybe they're going to go after that Nobel Peace Prize.
Every 10 years.
Every 10 years, yeah. Well, see, I've been on the same track for 33 decades. I don't know where I'm going to end up. But that's about all I got on that one.
Anybody else?
Hey there. I'm wondering, in your work experience, your life experience, your research, what have you seen the impact of cultural activities like music, theater, literature, philosophy? What impact have they had on global development, if any?
There's a colleague of mine from the North-South Institute who now teaches development studies at Carleton. And he's a specialist in Latin America and in particular in Brazil. But he starts all of his courses, one with a study of Pentecostal religious movements in Latin America. I said, but isn't this a political economy? Of course. He says, yes. And then he talks about music, and he talks about pop culture, and he talks about what's on the soap operas. He says, we have such a perverse view of what it is that makes a society move, where the values are. So even a political economy course, fine. We need to look at systemic things, but the experience, the lived experience of people is, in any community, in this community, in a community in another part of the world, is where you have to start. So I think for those who are lucky enough to have traveled in the world and lived with families in cultures other than their own, where you have to, this is why Canada World Youth was such a gift, where you get up and you go to the temple and you get the rice and all those daily experiences are necessary for understanding what is of value in those communities. The best education in the world is to be somewhere else, in somebody else's home, for as long as you can manage.
Yep.
Alison, can you comment on the merger of Foreign Affairs and CETA and how that has played itself out?
Sure.
I'll just one example that was troubling. Like Julia, I came out of the NGO community as well, and was really concerned when we started seeing Canadian mining companies and NGOs collaborating on the ground. Either it was going to be very rich in pragmatic possibility, or it was going to be kind of a failure of sort of, you know, partnerships. And I sort of worried that the merger of CETA and Foreign Affairs could have that same risk. You know, the balance of power and how that's playing itself out. Your comments would be interesting.
Part of the answer is just any amalgamation of two organizations is just really messy. And like seriously, 2 years later, we still don't all have the email messages. So if I invite Jim to a meeting, he may or may not get an invite. So the cultural integration follows on the messiness of sorting out org charts and email addresses, and that's the part that's going to answer your question. What is the culture of an amalgamated place going to be like? And certainly I've heard a number of people concerned, well, does this mean that the trade agenda is the whole of Canada's international agenda? I actually think, and this isn't kind of an official's point of view, this is kind of a person who lives in an organization's point of view, I think it's going to be fabulous for development. If only for, again, people who do organizational behavior studies, sociologists, the organizations shape the views of the people inside, the processes, who needs to approve what, who goes to what meetings. It's a powerful shaper of ideas about what's possible. When we were another department, in another building, in another province, because CETA sits on the Quebec side and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade sits on the Ontario side. You didn't have to talk to us. You didn't have to check with our managers if this would be a dumb idea. Now, everybody who works on a particular country desk have to talk to each other. Everybody has to share information. Everybody's got to be consulted. Has to be joint approval. The former CETA still holds the majority of the money, and we are protected through the ODAAA about what we get to spend it on. It can only be spent on A, B, and C. I think amalgamation, once we work through all the yuckiness of the organizational change, will have a culture that's much more powerfully pro-development and development conscious than was the case before. But that's a prediction, not a guarantee.
One can hope. Anybody else? Yeah, one more.
Hi. You spoke about technology quite a bit and in a very positive light for the most part, and the examples that you gave were certainly excellent examples of how technology has helped many people in many ways. My concern sometimes is the sort of the negative side of technology and social media with regard to sort of the onslaught of information and sometimes the white noise effect that happens when you're just constantly exposed to what's happening in the world and what, you know, whether or not you can do anything about it, and whether clicking on this link is going to do anything, and you know, signing this petition is going to do anything, or just forwarding this link is going to make a difference. All of these sorts of small activities that may feel like you're doing something, and then you can sit back and relax because you've done your part. I wonder how that might be changing the way people approach activism and making a change.
The power of organizing using a whole variety of technologies, including social media, for organizing applies both to positive change and other kinds of change that may be frightening. The same technology that allows us to share information about human rights abuses can also share information that sponsors hatred and violence. So part of the deal, the Pandora's box deal, is that we take on with the technology